At 4:47 in the morning on April 30th, 1975, the last American helicopter lifted off from the roof of the United States Embassy in Saigon. Inside were 11 Marines from the embassy security guard, the final Americans to leave Vietnam after more than a decade of war. Below them, hundreds of Vietnamese were still on the embassy grounds, desperately trying to reach the helicopters that would never return for them. Outside the compound walls, North Vietnamese tanks were already rolling through the streets. Within hours, those tanks would crash through the gates of the presidential palace and South Vietnam would cease to exist. The fall of Saigon was the chaotic, desperate end to America's longest war. And the images of helicopters evacuating people from rooftops, of embassy gates being stormed, of people clinging to the skids of departing aircraft, those images would define how the world remembered the entire Vietnam War. But the fall didn't happen in a single day. It was the culmination of a collapse that took 55 days from start to finish, during which South Vietnam's million-man army disintegrated, entire provinces fell without a fight, and 3 million people fled their homes in panic. What happened in those 55 days is a story of political failure, military disaster, and human tragedy on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Because South Vietnam didn't lose because it ran out of soldiers or weapons. It lost because everyone, from the generals to the common soldiers to the civilians, stopped believing it could win, and once that belief died, the end came faster than anyone predicted. Now, before we get into those final catastrophic weeks, we need to understand how South Vietnam went from a functioning country with a massive military to total collapse in less than 2 months. Because the fall of Saigon didn't start in April 1975, it started 2 years earlier when the United States signed a peace agreement that everyone knew wouldn't last. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. On paper, the agreement ended American military involvement in Vietnam. US forces would withdraw completely. North Vietnam would release all American prisoners of war, and a ceasefire would take effect between North and South Vietnamese forces, with both sides holding the territory they controlled at the time of the ceasefire. The agreement was supposed to give South Vietnam a chance to survive on its own, while allowing the United States to extract itself from the war with some semblance of honour intact. But everyone involved knew the truth. The ceasefire wouldn't hold. North Vietnam had no intention of abandoning its goal of unifying Vietnam under communist rule, and South Vietnam couldn't survive without massive American military and economic support. President Richard Nixon had promised South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu that if North Vietnam violated the ceasefire, the United States would respond with force, American air power would return, aid would continue, South Vietnam wouldn't be abandoned. Thieu reluctantly signed the agreement based on those promises, but Nixon didn't tell Thieu that he was lying, or maybe Nixon believed his promises at the time and circumstances changed. Either way, by 1975, Nixon was gone, resigned over Watergate. American public opinion had completely turned against any further involvement in Vietnam. And the US Congress had passed legislation prohibiting American military action in Southeast Asia and slashing aid to South Vietnam. From 1973 to 1975, North Vietnam systematically violated the ceasefire. They rebuilt their forces in the south. They improved the Ho Chi Minh Trail into an all-weather highway that could move tanks and heavy artillery. They positioned entire divisions within striking distance of South Vietnamese cities. They built up massive stockpiles of ammunition and supplies for the offensive they knew was coming. The Soviet Union and China provided weapons, fuel, and equipment. North Vietnam wasn't hiding its preparations. Everyone could see it happening. And South Vietnam couldn't do anything about it because American air power, the one thing that had consistently stopped North Vietnamese offensives in the past, was gone. The B-52s weren't coming back. The fighter bombers weren't coming back. South Vietnam was on its own. By early 1975, South Vietnam's situation was desperate. The South Vietnamese military, the ARVN, officially had over 1 million men under arms. But the reality was more complicated. Desertion rates were climbing. Corruption was endemic. Units were under strength and poorly supplied. Morale was terrible because soldiers knew that American support was gone and suspected their government couldn't survive without it. South Vietnamese forces were spread, thin, trying to defend the entire country, from the DMZ in the north to the Mekong Delta in the south. They held the cities and the major roads, but had abandoned the countryside to the Viet Cong. This strategy might have worked with American air support. Without it, South Vietnamese forces were vulnerable to being cut off, surrounded, and overwhelmed. The North Vietnamese High Command met in Hanoi in December 1974 to plan the final offensive. They originally envisioned a 2-year campaign. 1975 would be spent taking key positions and isolating South Vietnamese forces. 1976 would see the actual push to Saigon and final victory. But they built in flexibility. If opportunities presented themselves, if South Vietnamese resistance collapsed faster than expected, the timeline could accelerate. This flexibility would prove crucial because once the offensive started, South Vietnam fell apart so quickly that even the North Vietnamese were surprised. The offensive began on January 6, 1975 in Phuoc Long Province, about 75 miles north of Saigon. North Vietnamese forces surrounded the provincial capital and laid siege to it. The South Vietnamese garrison held out for 2 weeks before being overrun. Phuoc Long Province became the first entire province to fall to the communists since the ceasefire, and the American response was nothing. No airstrikes, no aid, no diplomatic pressure, nothing. The fall of Phuoc Long was a test and South Vietnam failed it. More importantly, the United States failed it. The message was clear to both Hanoi and Saigon. America was gone, and South Vietnam was on its own. Emboldened by the lack of American response, North Vietnamese commanders planned their next move. The target was the Central Highlands, the mountainous region in central Vietnam that had been contested throughout the war. If the North Vietnamese could take the highlands, they would cut south, Vietnam in half, separating the northern provinces from Saigon and the south. The campaign began in early March with attacks on multiple fronts designed to disperse South Vietnamese forces and prevent them from concentrating their defences. On March 10, 1975, North Vietnamese forces attacked Ban Me Thuot, the capital of Dac province in the heart of the Central Highlands. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, using tanks and heavy artillery. The South Vietnamese defenders, elements of the 23rd ARVN division, were outnumbered and caught by surprise. They fought for 2 days before the city fell. The loss of Ban Me Thuot was a disaster for South Vietnam. It wasn't just a provincial capital. It controlled the roads through the highlands. Without it, South Vietnamese forces in the region couldn't be resupplied or reinforced. They were cut off. President Thieu made a decision that would seal South Vietnam's fate. Instead of fighting to retake Ban Me Thuot or defending other highland positions, he ordered a withdrawal. South Vietnamese forces would abandon the Central Highlands and fall back to defend the coast. Thieu believed he couldn't defend everywhere. He had to concentrate his forces to defend what mattered most, the coastal cities and Saigon. On paper, the strategy made sense. In reality, it triggered the collapse of South Vietnam. The order to withdraw reached Highland commanders on March 14th. They were told to move their forces east to the coast using Route 7B, a barely maintained road that hadn't been used for military movements in years. No one checked if the road was passable. No one coordinated air support or established security along the route. No one planned for what would happen when hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians all tried to use the same road at the same time. The withdrawal turned into a panicked retreat that became known as the Convoy of Tears. Military units, civilian, vehicles and refugees on foot all jammed onto Route 7B simultaneously. The convoy stretched for miles, moving at a crawl when it moved at all. North Vietnamese forces, realising what was happening, attacked the convoy with artillery and ambushes. South Vietnamese soldiers abandoned their vehicles and weapons, fleeing into the jungle. Others threw away their uniforms and tried to blend in with the refugees. Officers deserted their units. Entire formations ceased to exist as organised fighting forces. What was supposed to be an organised withdrawal became a rout. Of the 60,000 ARVN soldiers who began the retreat from the highlands, fewer than 20,000 reached the coast. The rest deserted, died, or were captured. The civilian cost was even worse. Hundreds of thousands of Highland civilians, many from ethnic minority groups who'd supported the South Vietnamese government and feared communist reprisals, fled alongside the military. They abandoned their homes, their possessions, everything, trying to reach safety on the coast. Many died on the road from North Vietnamese attacks, from accidents, from exhaustion and disease. The survivors reached coastal cities like Nha Trang and Thieu with nothing but the clothes they wore. The Central Highlands, which South Vietnam had held throughout the war, fell in less than 2 weeks, and the collapse had only just begun. Here's what made the Highland disaster so catastrophic beyond the territory lost. It shattered South Vietnamese morale completely. Soldiers and civilians alike realized that their government was abandoning entire regions without a fight. If the Highlands could be given up, what else would be abandoned? Where was safe? The panic spread faster than the North Vietnamese advance. In cities throughout central Vietnam, people began preparing to flee even before North Vietnamese forces arrived. And when military units saw civilians fleeing, they assumed defeat was inevitable and started fleeing, too. The psychological collapse fed on itself. The North Vietnamese High Command watched the Highland collapse and immediately revised their timeline. The 2-year campaign was accelerated. New orders went out: maintain pressure everywhere, exploit success aggressively, don't give South Vietnam time to reorganize. The race was on to see how much of South Vietnam could be taken before the monsoon season started in May. As it turned out, there would be plenty of time, because over the next 6 weeks South Vietnam would effectively cease to exist as a functioning country. The next domino to fall was Thieu, the old imperial capital in the northern provinces. Thieu had been the scene of brutal fighting during the Tet Offensive in 1968. The city had held then, with American and South Vietnamese forces retaking it after weeks of house-to-house combat. But in March 1975, there were no Americans, and the South Vietnamese forces defending Thieu were demoralized, undersupplied, and watching the Highland collapse with growing dread. North Vietnamese forces began moving on Thieu in mid-March. They didn't even have to attack the city directly, they just cut the roads leading to it, isolating the garrison. The South Vietnamese commander, seeing his forces cut off and knowing no relief was coming, ordered evacuation. On March 25th, South Vietnamese forces withdrew from Thieu without a fight. The city that had cost so much blood to hold 7 years earlier was abandoned in a day. The fall of Thieu triggered panic in Da Nang, South Vietnam's second largest city and the main military base in the northern provinces. Da Nang was where the first American combat troops had landed in 1965. It had been the nerve centre for American operations in Corps for the entire war. And now it was about to become the site of one of the worst disasters of the entire conflict. Da Nang's population in normal times was roughly 500,000. By late March 1975, that number had swelled to nearly 2 million as refugees from Thieu and other northern areas flooded into the city. Every road, every boat, every flight into Da Nang brought more desperate people trying to reach safety. The city's infrastructure couldn't handle it. Food ran short, water systems were overwhelmed, hospitals filled beyond capacity, and then word spread that Da Nang was going to be evacuated too, that the government was abandoning the north entirely. The panic that had been building for weeks exploded into complete chaos. South Vietnamese military commanders in Da Nang lost control of their units. Soldiers deserted en masse to try to get their families out. Some units held together long enough to fight rearguard actions covering the evacuation. Others simply dissolved. The Da Nang airport became a scene of absolute bedlam. Military transports were supposed to evacuate ARVN units in organised lifts. Instead, thousands of soldiers and civilians stormed the runway surrounding aircraft, climbing onto wings and landing gear, fighting each other for any space on any plane that might get them out. Pilots took off with people clinging to the outside of their aircraft. Some fell to their deaths as the planes gained altitude. Others were crushed in landing gear wells. At the port, the scene was equally desperate. Any vessel that could float was commandeered. Military ships, civilian freighters, fishing boats, all were mobbed by people trying to escape. The South Vietnamese Navy tried to maintain order while evacuating their own personnel and equipment. They failed. Ships designed to carry hundreds left with thousands aboard, decks packed so tight people couldn't move. Some vessels capsized from overloading. Others were damaged by artillery fire as North Vietnamese forces reached the outskirts of the city. The lucky ones made it to sea and headed south towards Saigon or offshore islands. The unlucky ones never left the harbour. On March 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese forces entered Da Nang. They found a city in ruins, abandoned by its defenders, filled with refugees who had nowhere left to run. The city that had been America's main base in Vietnam for a decade fell without a real fight, and the manner of its fall, the panic and chaos and desperate evacuation, foreshadowed exactly what would happen in Saigon 1 month later. Because if Da Nang, with its massive military presence, and its hundreds of thousands of troops couldn't be held, what chance did Saigon have? Let me tell you about some of the people who tried to maintain order during those final days in Da Nang, because not everyone fled and not everyone gave up. Major General Ngo Quang Truong commanded South Vietnamese forces in a corps, the northern military region that included Thieu and Da Nang. Truong was widely considered one of South Vietnam's best generals. He'd fought with distinction throughout the war, earning respect from both Vietnamese and American officers. When the order came to abandon the highlands, Truong argued against it. He believed giving up territory without fighting would destroy morale and make everything harder to defend. He was overruled. When Thieu fell and Da Nang became untenable, Truong tried to organize an orderly withdrawal. He established defensive perimeters, coordinated evacuation priorities, and attempted to maintain unit cohesion. But the panic was too widespread. His soldiers deserted. His orders were ignored. Units that should have covered the evacuation instead fled on their own. Truong stayed until the very end, one of the last to leave Da Nang aboard a South Vietnamese Navy ship. He made it to Saigon and would be there for the final fall. But the loss of the North broke something in him. He'd done everything right tactically and it hadn't mattered. The rot was too deep. A handful of American officials remained in Da Nang trying to help with the evacuation. They weren't supposed to be there. The official American presence in Da Nang had ended with the Paris Peace Accords. But the US consulate still operated, and some Americans stayed to process refugees and coordinate with South Vietnamese authorities. When the collapse came, these Americans found themselves trying to evacuate not just Americans, but thousands of Vietnamese who'd worked with the United States and now faced certain death if they stayed. The consulate staff worked around the clock processing paperwork, arranging flights, and trying to bring some order to the chaos. They succeeded in evacuating thousands. They failed to evacuate tens of thousands more. Some Americans chartered private planes with their own money to fly out as many people as possible. Others used their positions to push Vietnamese friends and colleagues onto military flights. It wasn't official, it wasn't authorized, but it saved lives. One American consulate officer later described the airport scene as the closest thing to hell he'd ever seen. Families separated in the chaos, children lost, people trampled, the sound of artillery getting closer, and the knowledge that every plane that left meant someone else wasn't getting out. He said the thing that haunted him most wasn't the people who made it onto planes. It was the faces of the people left behind, watching the last aircraft take off, knowing they'd been abandoned. By early April, South Vietnam had lost the entire northern half of the country. The Central Highlands were gone. The coastal cities from the DMZ to Nha Trang were in North Vietnamese hands. Roughly half of South Vietnam's territory and population was now under communist control. And the collapse had taken less than a month. In Saigon, President Thieu gave speeches about fighting to the last man and defending the capital, but everyone knew it was over. The only questions were how long Saigon would hold and how many people could get out before it fell. The United States government faced a decision: stay and continue trying to support South Vietnam knowing it was futile, or begin evacuating Americans and at-risk Vietnamese while there was still time. The decision was complicated by politics. Admitting defeat, starting an evacuation, would be a public relations disaster. It would confirm that America had lost the war. But waiting too long risked American lives and guaranteed that fewer Vietnamese allies could be evacuated. The evacuation planning began in early April under the code name Operation Frequent Wind. It was supposed to be an orderly process. American citizens would leave first through commercial flights. Then, if necessary, military helicopters would evacuate embassy personnel and key Vietnamese allies from designated landing zones. The plan assumed there would be time for organized lifts, that Saigon wouldn't fall immediately, that order could be maintained. Every single one of those assumptions was wrong. On April 8, 1975, a South Vietnamese Air Force pilot flew his F-5 fighter to a North Vietnamese airbase and defected. During debriefing, he provided detailed information about South Vietnamese air defences around Saigon. The next day, April 9th, a pilot who stayed loyal to South Vietnam flew his F-5 into a bombing run on the presidential palace in Saigon in a bizarre one-man coup attempt. He missed the palace but killed and wounded civilians in nearby buildings before being shot down. The incident showed how fractured South Vietnam had become. Some were defecting to the north, others were attempting coups. Trust was gone at every level. President Thieu gave a final speech on April 21, 1975. He blamed the United States for abandoning South Vietnam. He blamed his own generals for failures. He resigned and fled the country, eventually ending up in Taiwan and then the United States. His departure removed any pretense that South Vietnam could continue fighting. The government was gone. All that remained was the question of surrender terms and who would be left holding the bag when the end came. Ambassador Graham Martin was the senior American official in Saigon. He'd been ambassador since 1973 and had spent those years insisting that South Vietnam could survive, that American aid would be enough, that evacuation planning was defeatist thinking. Even as South Vietnam collapsed around him, Martin resisted beginning the evacuation. He believed that starting to evacuate would trigger panic and make the situation worse. He believed there was still time for negotiations, for a political settlement. He was wrong on every count, but his resistance to evacuation meant that when Operation Frequent Wind finally began, it would happen under the worst possible circumstances. The evacuation of American citizens through commercial flights continued through mid-April, though many Americans chose to stay, believing they had time or that they were needed. The real question was what to do about Vietnamese who'd worked with Americans, embassy employees, intelligence sources, military officers who'd fought alongside US forces, civilians whose association with America marked them for death if the communists won. The United States had a moral obligation to these people, but evacuating them required admitting the war was lost and South Vietnam was finished. Ambassador Martin refused to authorize large-scale Vietnamese evacuation until it was almost too late. On April 21st, the same day Thieu resigned, the North Vietnamese began shelling Tan Son Nhut Air Base, Saigon's main airport. This was the facility that was supposed to be used for the evacuation. The shelling continued intermittently, making flight operations dangerous. Some flights got through, others were cancelled. Each passing day meant fewer options for evacuation, because the North Vietnamese were closing in on the city from all directions. By April 28th, North Vietnamese forces had reached the outskirts of Saigon. Artillery could hit anywhere in the city. The roads out were cut. The only way out was by helicopter or by ship from the Saigon River docks. On the morning of April 29, 1975, Operation Frequent Wind officially began. This was the final evacuation, using helicopters to lift Americans and Vietnamese from designated pickup zones to ships of the US 7th Fleet waiting offshore. The operation was supposed to be orderly. Buses would take evacuees to specific landing zones. Helicopters would arrive on schedule. Embassy staff would process people and ensure only authorized evacuees boarded. None of that happened. Tan Son Nhut Air Base took heavy shelling in the early morning hours of April 29th. A direct hit destroyed a C-130 transport on the ground. Shrapnel from exploding shells killed 2 US Marines who were part of the security force. It was the last American combat deaths in Vietnam. The decision was made to evacuate from the Defense Attaché Office compound at Tan Son Nhut and from the embassy itself, using only helicopters. Fixed-wing aircraft couldn't use the damaged runways, and the shelling made the airbase too dangerous anyway. Marine Corps CH-53 helicopters began arriving at the Dao compound mid-morning. They came in waves, landing in a parking lot that had been designated as the primary landing zone. Each helicopter could carry up to 50 people, depending on the aircraft variant and weight considerations. The goal was to evacuate Americans first, then Vietnamese who had proper documentation proving they'd worked with the US government. The reality was that thousands of Vietnamese had gathered at the Dao compound, many without proper paperwork, all desperate to escape. Marines manning the perimeter tried to maintain order and process evacuees, but the numbers were overwhelming. At the embassy in downtown Saigon, the situation was even more chaotic. The embassy compound wasn't designed for helicopter operations. There was a small helicopter pad on the roof that could handle 1 helicopter at a time. The courtyard could fit larger helicopters, but barely. And surrounding the embassy were thousands of Vietnamese who'd made their way there hoping to be evacuated. Some had worked directly with Americans, others had family connections. Many just knew the embassy was the last hope for getting out. The embassy gates stayed closed to prevent being overrun, but that meant Marines and embassy staff had to decide who would be let in and who would be left outside. There was no good way to make those decisions. Inside the embassy compound, Americans and Vietnamese who'd been pre-approved for evacuation waited in stifling heat for helicopters that came irregularly and couldn't take everyone at once. The evacuation plan had called for processing centres, manifest checks, orderly boarding. Instead, it was controlled chaos. Embassy staff burned classified documents in oil drums. They destroyed communications equipment. They tried to evacuate artwork and cultural items that had been on loan from Vietnamese museums. Some made it out, most didn't. The priority was people, not things. The helicopters came from the 7th Fleet carriers operating in the South China Sea about 40 miles offshore. CH-53 Sea Stallions and CH-46 Sea Knights flew in relays, landing at the Dao compound or the embassy, loading evacuees, flying back to the carriers to drop them off, refueling and returning for another lift. It was dangerous flying. North Vietnamese forces were in the city. Anti-aircraft guns were positioned around Saigon. Pilots flew in knowing they could be shot down at any moment. The North Vietnamese held their fire, either because they didn't want to provoke American retaliation or because they wanted the Americans to leave peacefully, but the threat was always there. By late afternoon on April 29th, the Dao compound had been largely evacuated. Over 5,000 people, Americans and Vietnamese, had been lifted out. But the embassy evacuation was falling behind schedule. Thousands of Vietnamese were still in the compound waiting for helicopters. Thousands more were outside the walls, climbing fences, bribing guards, trying desperately to get inside. The Marines manning the embassy perimeter were exhausted, having been on duty for over 24 hours straight. They were seeing the desperation firsthand, watching families beg to be let in, knowing most wouldn't make it out. Ambassador Martin refused to leave until he'd evacuated everyone possible. He stayed at the embassy coordinating with Washington, with the 7th Fleet, with anyone who could send more helicopters. But there weren't enough helicopters. There wasn't enough time. The North Vietnamese were holding back for now, but that could change at any moment. At some point, the evacuation would have to end whether everyone was out or not. As darkness fell on April 29th, the helicopter lifts continued under floodlights. The distinctive thump of rotor blades became the soundtrack to Saigon's last night. Inside the embassy, evacuees huddled in groups watching the helicopters come and go, calculating whether they'd get out. Some had been waiting since morning. Others had just arrived, having bribed or fought their way into the compound. The courtyard was packed. The hallways were packed. Every room was full of people waiting. The most iconic image from the fall of Saigon shows a helicopter on a rooftop with people climbing a ladder to reach it. That photo is often misidentified as the embassy, but it was actually an apartment building used by CIA personnel. The scene it captured, desperate people climbing toward a helicopter representing their last hope of escape, could have been from dozens of locations around Saigon that night. The Americans who'd promised to stay, who'd promised South Vietnam would never be abandoned, were leaving, and they couldn't take everyone with them. At 10:47 p.m. on April 29th, Ambassador Martin boarded a helicopter from the embassy roof. He'd been ordered multiple times to evacuate and had delayed as long as possible. But with North Vietnamese forces entering the city and time running out, he finally left. His departure marked the end of official American presence in South Vietnam. But the evacuation continued because hundreds of Vietnamese were still in the embassy compound, still waiting for helicopters that were still coming. The Marines manning the embassy perimeter received orders around midnight. Seal the building, move everyone inside, prepare to evacuate only the Marines and essential personnel. Stop bringing more Vietnamese into the compound. The orders meant abandoning everyone still outside the walls. It also meant lying to the Vietnamese already inside about whether more helicopters were coming. Because if they knew the evacuation was ending, panic would make the final lifts impossible. The last group of Vietnamese evacuees left the embassy around 3 a.m. on April 30th. They were employees of the embassy itself, people who'd worked most directly with Americans and faced certain arrest or worse if they stayed. After they departed, only Americans remained. Specifically, the Marine security guards who'd been holding the perimeter and a handful of embassy staff coordinating the final lifts. They destroyed the last documents. They disabled the remaining equipment. They climbed to the roof and waited for the last helicopters. At 4:47 a.m. on April 30th, 1975, Marine CH-46 helicopter Swift 22 lifted off from the embassy roof with the final 11 Marines aboard. Ambassador Martin's orders had been to evacuate all Americans. That mission was complete. The orders had also been to evacuate as many Vietnamese as possible. That mission was incomplete. Hundreds remained in the compound, locked inside the building to prevent them from rushing the final helicopters. Thousands more were outside the walls. When dawn broke and they realized the helicopters weren't coming back, the despair was total. North Vietnamese tanks entered Saigon unopposed on the morning of April 30th. They rolled through streets that were eerily quiet. Some South Vietnamese soldiers were still in uniform, manning positions, not sure what to do. Others had gone home to their families. Many had fled to the docks hoping to find boats leaving the country. The famous image of a North Vietnamese tank crashing through the gates of the presidential palace was filmed at 11:30 a.m. A soldier jumped out of the tank and ran up the steps carrying the Viet Cong flag. Inside the palace, South Vietnamese officials who'd stayed behind waited to surrender formally. The war was over. The human cost of those final 55 days is almost impossible to calculate accurately. Hundreds of thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the collapse. Some estimates put military casualties at over 200,000. Civilian casualties were even higher. Millions became refugees. Some eventually made it out of Vietnam through official programs or by boat. Many didn't. The Vietnamese who'd worked with Americans and didn't get evacuated faced re-education camps, which were effectively prisons where anyone associated with the old government or the Americans could be held indefinitely. Some spent years in these camps, some died there. The United States evacuated approximately 140,000 people during the final weeks, including Operation Frequent Wind and other smaller evacuations. Of those, about 50,000 were evacuated in the final days using helicopters. The 7th Fleet helicopter pilots flew over 650 sorties in 19 hours to pull this off. It was an impressive feat of coordination and courage under impossible circumstances, but it wasn't enough. For every person evacuated, several more were left behind. The images from the fall became iconic and controversial. Helicopters on rooftops, people climbing fences, the desperate faces of those left behind. These images contradicted everything America had said about Vietnam. They showed defeat. They showed abandonment. They showed the cost of a war that had lasted 20 years and achieved nothing. The fall of Saigon became shorthand for American failure, for promises broken, for the limits of American power. But here's what often gets lost in discussions of the fall. It was South Vietnam that fell, not just an American-backed regime. It was Vietnamese cities that were lost, Vietnamese families that were separated, Vietnamese soldiers who died in the final battles or spent years in prison camps afterward, Vietnamese civilians who lost their homes, their livelihoods, their futures. The American presence in Vietnam had been significant, but Vietnam's tragedy belonged to the Vietnamese people. Americans could leave, most. Vietnamese couldn't. The North Vietnamese victory was complete. They'd achieved their goal of unifying Vietnam under communist rule. They'd driven out the Americans. They'd defeated the South Vietnamese military. But the victory came at enormous cost. Millions dead over 30 years of war. The country devastated. The economy in ruins. The social fabric torn apart. The peace that came after 1975 wasn't the peace of reconciliation. It was the peace of exhaustion, where one side won because the other side simply couldn't fight anymore. For the Americans who served in Vietnam, the fall of Saigon was particularly bitter. They'd fought, they'd bled, they'd watched friends die. For what? To see the country they'd tried to defend collapse in weeks? To see the people they'd fought alongside abandoned? The Vietnam veterans who watched the fall on television or read about it in newspapers had to confront the fact that their sacrifices had ultimately been for nothing. South Vietnam was gone. The war was lost. And unlike veterans of other American wars who could point to clear victories or lasting achievements, Vietnam veterans had only questions about what it had all been for. The Marine security guards, who were the last Americans to leave Vietnam, became symbolic figures. They'd done their duty to the end. They'd maintained order in chaos. They'd been the last ones out, making sure everyone else got evacuated first. But they also had to live with the memory of the Vietnamese left behind, of the people who'd trusted America and been abandoned when the end came. Some of those Marines struggled with that knowledge for decades. Others made peace with it by acknowledging they'd done everything possible under impossible circumstances, but none of them forgot. One of those final Marines later described the moment his helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof. He said he looked down and saw faces looking up at them. Vietnamese faces, people who'd helped, America, people who'd believed the promises, people who were being left behind. He said that image, those faces, stayed with him forever. Every April 30th he remembered, not as a day of defeat necessarily, but as a day when promises were broken, and the cost of those broken promises was borne by people who trusted America. The fall of Saigon ended America's direct involvement in Vietnam, but it didn't end the consequences. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese fled the country in the years after the fall, becoming the boat people who risked death at sea rather than live under communist rule. Some reached refugee camps in neighbouring countries. Some were resettled in the United States, France, Australia and elsewhere. They built new lives but never forgot the country they'd lost. Their children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about Vietnam before the fall, about what was lost, about what might have been. The fall also shaped American foreign policy for decades. It became the template for what not to do. Don't commit to wars you're not willing to finish. Don't make promises to allies you can't keep. Don't assume military superiority guarantees political success. The phrase, "no more Vietnams," became shorthand for avoiding open-ended military commitments. But the lessons learned were sometimes the wrong lessons. The fall of Saigon taught that Americans needed to be more careful about where and how they intervened. It didn't teach that intervention itself was always wrong. The debate over what Vietnam meant and what lessons should be drawn from it continues to this day. 50 years after the fall, Saigon is now called Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam is unified under the communist government that won the war. The country is open to the West economically. American tourists visit Vietnam. American companies do business there. The war is history. But for those who lived through the fall, for the veterans who fought and the refugees who fled and the Vietnamese who stayed and survived, it will never be just history. It remains personal. It remains painful. And the images from April 1975 of helicopters and desperate people and a city falling remain the defining images of how that war ended. The fall of Saigon was the end of a war that should never have been fought the way it was fought. A war where tactical victories never added up to strategic success, where killing the enemy didn't mean winning the war, where promises were made that couldn't be kept, where the cost was borne by Vietnamese civilians and American soldiers who believed they were fighting for something worth defending. And in the end, after all the blood and all the sacrifice and all the years of fighting, South Vietnam fell anyway. Not because its soldiers couldn't fight, not because its people didn't want freedom, but because the support it needed to survive was withdrawn, because the American public lost faith, because political will collapsed, before the military did. The helicopters lifting off from embassy roofs, the crowds left behind, the tanks rolling through Saigon streets. These images captured a moment when promises meant nothing, and power meant everything. When the strong abandoned the weak and the weak paid the price. The fall of Saigon wasn't just the end of South Vietnam. It was the end of American credibility in Southeast Asia. The end of the idea that American power could shape the world according to American ideals. The end of innocence about what military force could achieve. And for the 11 Marines who were the last Americans out, for the pilots who flew the evacuation missions, for the embassy staff who processed evacuees knowing there would never be enough time or helicopters for everyone, for the Vietnamese who made it out and the Vietnamese who didn't, April 30th, 1975 was the day everything changed. The day the war ended. The day promises were broken. The day Saigon fell. They remember it differently. Americans remember the evacuation. Vietnamese remember the fall. But everyone who was there remembers the desperation, the chaos, the knowledge that history was turning a page and nothing would ever be the same again. That's what the fall of Saigon was. Not just a military defeat, not just the end of a war, but the end of an era. The end of American assumptions about its role in the world. The end of Vietnam as Vietnamese had known it. And the beginning of decades of reckoning with what had been lost, what had been won, and whether any of it had been worth the cost.